for joining us today on the Mental Health Mukbang. My name is Jeanie Wang. I'm a clinical psychologist in Houston, Texas. And today we are talking about unhealthy boundaries, how to spot them and what to do about them. So I am eating the ABC bar from Trader Joe's. It's an almond butter cocoa bar.
Okay, and I'm Christopher Wang. I'm an LMFT based out of Houston, Texas. I've got Flamin' Hot Doritos.
I could have sworn that Jenny was eating it last week too. Pretty convinced that that's all she eats. All right, my name's Jed. I'm a therapist from LA. I've got watermelon.
Why is everyone? No, you're not healthy. Chris isn't healthy. I was gonna say, wait, why is everyone eating healthy? So I'm Jeanie Chang, an LMFT from Raleigh, North Carolina, and today I'm gonna eat this one mochi because it takes me a long time to get through it because they're really chewy and thick. Yeah. From the
Is it gonna last the whole episode? You're gonna make that mochi last the whole episode.
It's my favorite Korean bakery, Tuleju, even though it's French sounding.
Good.
Tuleju. Yeah. Cool. Unhealthy boundaries.
All right. Mm-hmm. So what are unhealthy boundaries, guys?
Yeah. What do they look like? Unhealthy boundaries?
Well, I mean, a good mark of an unhealthy boundary is, how we talked about boundaries being on a spectrum, right? So if someone is disassociated from you, very detached from you, especially when you're trying to explain something, and on the other side, when people are codependent, I think those are two really good marks of unhealthy boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
I think those are
sorry, can you define codependent?
Codependence is when two people feel like they need each other in order to exist. There's just too much enmeshment between the two different people.
So kind of like boundaries don't exist between them then.
Absolutely.
I think that's a really important term to define for people right now is enmeshment. Because I think we said it a lot in the last episode, and we didn't actually
I didn't
define it.
Yeah.
So what is enmeshment? I think is a very good first question. We should have answered this in episode part 1 of boundaries because that's really important.
Well, if you break up the word in mesh, when you mesh things together, you can't distinguish. There's no distinguishment. So that's how I would best say it together when it's literally, but it's not, and when you say enmeshment, it's almost like a mess. And I'm kind of being dramatic about it, but when you're in this mess together, nothing can be taken apart, nothing can be seen. Two people look like one. That's how I would describe enmeshed boundaries, where there actually is no boundaries. There aren't defined at all. Not even rigid, not even, what's the opposite of rigid? Permeable, yeah, or diffused.
You know what's a really good example? Aloofa. Aloofa is a really good example of enmeshment.
I mean, the Aloofa.
Yeah.
I don't understand because a loofah is kind of permeable.
No. I meant like the.
Make sure you're talking about the shower thing or the bath thing. Okay.
Yeah, the shower thing. Because when you look at it, it's like this one glob of stuff, right? You can't really tell what it is. It's just how is it held together? What's going on here? Are there separate pieces or what's happening? Maybe that's not the best example.
See that? I'm not very visual, but I could see that. But you get.
Let me think of a better analogy.
The mess.
Yeah, okay. I would use the analogy of Play-Doh, right? When you've got two things of Play-Doh together, if they're rigid, they're not actually attached to each other.
They're dry.
They can go, they're dry. They can go either way. When they have healthy boundaries, they're together, but they're still distinctively they're two different colors. But when they're enmeshed is when you mix them up and it just becomes that muddy brown, gross color that everyone hates with Play-Doh. That's what enmeshment is. And they have a hard time separating. Once you become enmeshed, it's very hard to separate the two together and become distinct.
It apart. It's almost like sticky. They're very sticky together. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I was great analogy. I like that because I don't like Play-Doh actually. The smell of it. I was going to ask you this. So I know we're answering still the question of what do unhealthy boundaries look like, but I feel like this question relates. A lot of what we see that could be examples of unhealthy boundaries is the term parentification.
Definitely.
Where unconventionally non-traditional roles are reversed and they're hence the unhealthy boundaries. How would you explain what parentification looks like?
So parentification is, in a broad sense, the idea where traditionally parental roles, like decision making or like generally like adulting things, are having to be taken care of by a child. So whether that's paying the bills or looking after the siblings or whatever it is, it's generally taking on what you would traditionally see as a parental role and then making a child kind of take that spot.
Mhm.
And we're not
Yeah.
talking about like you're 18 and you're an adult and you're like kind of independent and you're like got your own thing going on, but we're talking about like you're 12, right? And you're the one that's making a lot of important decisions
Yeah.
and
A
like
lot of
making.
times they don't get to experience like the developmental stages, right? Of infancy, childhood, adolescence, late adolescence, adulthood. I ran into it a lot when I worked at juvenile detention, right? Either because parents were always at work and they had to take care of all of their siblings, or if their
Mhm.
parents were addicts and they had to take care of everything, they had to, kind of maintain the household. Shameless is a show. I won't call it a good
I know
show.
the show.
I don't like that show particularly, but it has a very good, clear examples of what it looks like to be parentified. And also, I actually saw a meme about it in the group, and it was talking about how when you realized when you were like 8 years old and you had to translate everything for your parents, and take care of the bills and handle customer service. That's an excellent example of parentification. I had
Mhm.
I
a
was just gonna say that. Yeah.
yeah,
Especially in our culture where English is not the first language,
Mm.
where
absolutely.
the children have to translate for their parents and pretty much take over as the role as a parent, you know? Yeah.
I had someone rear end me, and he was Latin American, and he didn't speak any English, but his 8-year-old son had to come out and like trade insurance with me, and I had to talk to him, and be like, hey, like this is what's going on. I ended up letting them go at the end of it because the damage just wasn't enough, right? But that's not fair for an 8-year-old child to have feel that anxiety and worry on top of after just getting into an accident, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, so I brought that term up because that to me is an example of unhealthy boundaries. And I see that quite often in like our community.
But
Mhm.
I think one of those things is like out of necessity, like what are the alternatives for
Mhm.
immigrant families, right?
It's true.
Like what options do we have? Um
Mhm.
I mean, of course, it's not an unhealthy. I think I personally think it's not a healthy boundary, right? But in order to function, like what sometimes families don't have a choice, right? And how can we take that and understand it and frame it in a way that we can better utilize that as.
Mhm.
And
And I
that's a
think
great question.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to what Jed brought up is it speaks to a more systems level issue, right? Where immigrants come into this country and if they don't have networks, right? If they don't have family who've been here to navigate that for them, then yeah, they are largely on their own. And so it does fall to that first and second generation. And, we were talking about parentification. And in some ways, right, it's a breakdown of boundaries, right? Parent boundaries, child boundaries. Um, and and I feel like, when a, a child is parentified, it is also a survival strategy, right? So they're able to develop resourcefulness and all of that. But what's lost in their abilities is they don't know where they can set boundaries because things are at high stakes.
Right.
So they can't say, no, I don't want to translate when you go see your OBGYN and I'm 11 and I need to translate for my mom because that makes me uncomfortable. They can't voice that.
Right.
Or no, I don't want to play marriage counselor between you and dad because you guys have marital problems due
That's a
to
big one.
acculturation stress, right? And so what happens is the child, as they become adults, they now have internalized the sense of everybody else matters more than me and I'm not allowed to say what my boundaries are to protect myself.
Were we going to discuss in this episode, just to be clear, what we can do about unhealthy boundaries? Is that the next episode?
I think the next episode is going to be specific or
Mhm.
more delving into the
Okay.
specifics. This
Yeah.
one can definitely give tips. And as a disclaimer, when we talk about all of these different concepts, Our purpose is not to say, "Hey, all of your childhoods were terrible. Realize it,"
Right.
right? Because
Right.
that's what something I tell my clients all the time. You have to give each other grace of humanity. I'm not here to demand perfection of anyone, right? We all
Yeah.
have failed. It's just we all need to fail better. That's the way I look at this.
Or
So
learn
help
from our
identify.
failures.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot
Yeah.
of identify these things and see where we can improve and adapt in the future, not, you know, necessarily dwell on the past.
Mm-hmm.
Because if there's anything that we can't change, it's what's already happened.
Right.
Right.
Mhm.
But we can understand it better and provide it a context and also develop compassion towards our parents because it must have sucked. Sorry
Mhm.
to use that word. I don't know if you can
Yeah.
bleep that
Because
out.
that's a
But
legit term of acculturation stress that we have
yes,
not dealt with.
Sure.
and it's traumatic, right? And so if we're coming from a trauma-informed perspective, it's not like what was wrong with you that you couldn't figure this out. It was like what happened to you such that this had to develop as a way to cope. Um,
Absolutely.
so I always say to my clients, like, there's never any condemnation or judgment towards how our parents could or could not show up for us. They were limited by their lack of awareness that this was even an issue. So, how do y'all know for yourselves internally that an unhealthy boundary or setup has happened? What are some cues that kind of give you that feedback and let you know?
Well, for me, I think there's a lot of emotional signs that you can see. One being, do you feel invisible, right? Do you
Mhm.
feel as if you're just not being heard? That's how conflict escalates, is when someone doesn't feel like their emotions or feelings or thoughts are being heard or validated, right? A common theme in Asian households is having no privacy. Um, Whenever you feel like you have to take on someone else's thoughts or opinions, right? Those are all examples of enmeshment. Another example might be on the flip side, if you start to have extremely defensive reactions and you're not sure why. If you meet someone and they say something that might be innocuous or neutral, and you immediately meet them with aggression, that might be a sign that you have resentment towards past transgressions to your boundaries.
Mhm.
Yeah. And so I would say, based on my own experience, I would define also unhealthy boundaries, bringing, choosing not the relationship, but choosing perhaps rules, traditions over the emotional connection. So I liked what Chris said about the first sign to me is when I myself feel like the rules of my life have completely shifted to the point that I'm like, wait, what do I believe? And it's an example of I'm trying to say, if I'm going to be very specific, is when I entered another family, meaning in marriage, marrying a fellow Asian, but then their entire family was very different from mine when it came to Korean values. I don't disagree with them. It was just that they came from a time of 1970s Korea, where I
Yeah.
was brought up here and completely American. And so
Mm.
my world shifted, and I felt very disconnected, even questioning, wait a second, do I believe in this? Because I wasn't taught this way, that I am treated this way. So the unhealthy boundaries there was actually, that was very rigid. It was very rigid. This is this is the way it is. You are, entering it into marriage, not with the family, but you know how it can feel that way, right? And this is the way it's going to be. So we don't really know and care who you are. Sorry to be that negative, but this is the way we are, and you are going to be treated like this. So it was very difficult. And why I questioned when I said to everybody, hey, do we want to talk about skills and tips? Because the one thing I do want to share to help with our own well-being, the Chang family here, my nuclear family, we did have to cut off some ties for some amount of time. It's not what I would always recommend, but it was for the health of me, my husband, and our four kids, who at the time we only had three. But I'm sharing this because even time can heal, and wounds are, we're much better, and now we are in communication, but that needed to happen. So that was a 3-year cut. And I
Mm.
know Jenny knows that story, but that is what had to happen because of the rigidity that
Yeah.
was not good for me.
Mhm. Yeah.
I think another example of when you can kind of see when boundaries are being violated is when you or the other person becomes incredibly detached, right? If someone's telling you something emotional and for whatever reason you are unable to hear what it is they're saying or feel the emotions that they're feeling, there's probably something that led up to that point that has created that dynamic in your relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Like that detached.
I think for
Mhm.
me, anger is the most prominent emotion when a boundary has been crossed. I
Yeah,
think the way I see it is resentment, boundaries sometimes are small. And so maybe somebody gets to know you and they make a small boundary because they don't know you and you don't say anything. And then it gets bigger and then it gets bigger. And so I'm not angry because it's not a major breach, but I'm getting resentful.
sure.
I'm getting irritated. I'm getting annoyed. And as I fail to communicate that annoyance and that resentment and frustration, it eventually builds to what Jed says is like a deal breaker, right? Now they've hit that point where I am pissed
Yeah,
and I'm going to let them know. And
Mm.
so I think, like Chris was saying, like listening to that emotional content can provide you with some information of maybe I should say something earlier this time. Maybe I shouldn't let that slide. We're talking about, people who say these microaggressive things. And sometimes we even question, is that real? Did that really just happen? Right. And so if we call out those boundaries earlier on, it gives us a chance with that person to say, hey, where is that boundary? What can
sure.
you say around me and what can you not?
Yeah. Are any
So
of y'all
yeah.
emotionally focused? Do any of y'all four do EFT?
No, I don't. I've read about it, but
Yeah.
no, I
Say it
haven't.
again.
EFT, emotionally focused
Yeah,
therapy?
I
Yeah.
know of it, but I don't really utilize it.
So that's a big one with me. And a lot of times, what I
Mm.
tell clients is that anger is not an emotion that you have in a vacuum. Anger is always a response to another emotion, right? So anger is often how we communicate these things, but what we really want to communicate is our hurt, our resentment, our irritation, our disrespect, our sadness, our fear, right? A lot of times we feel like we are unable to express those emotions, and it builds and builds until we only can express it in anger. So, you don't necessarily you want to be honest with what your emotions are telling you. And you don't necessarily have to be, when we talk about setting boundaries, you don't have to be necessarily um, offensive with it, but be clear, right? So if you feel like something comes out and you feel like it might be a microaggression and you're feeling, some of that resentment or that irritation or that disrespect, ask them to expand first. Ask them to clarify. Make them cement their position so you can then understand how to respond and react to it.
Mm.
Sure.
Yeah, I
So would you
will.
agree with this statement? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jed.
Oh, I was just gonna say, yeah. For in general, I feel like for clients and for myself, the most prominent emotion, the most prominent notification that you can get when your boundaries are violated is strong emotional reaction. Um, I think for some of us, anger. For others, it might be something else. For me, it also does come out as irritation. It does come out as annoying. Like there's nothing wrong with this person, but for some reason I'm annoyed because of whatever reason. It's usually like you said, it's a buildup of small things here and there, or like if anything, like I know that if something has happened earlier in the day that had already violated my boundaries, something later on that day that might be like usually something I just don't care about, I might be more highlighted to that and
Mm.
more psychoeducation. That's priming for anybody who wants to look that up. It's like you're set up for a certain kind of thing and you're kind of expecting everything to kind of be like, right? So somebody pisses you off in the morning, everything else might set you off. Um, so, but it is like, I'm going to give an example as a therapist of a moment that I'm kind of not proud of. As a therapist, you're supposed to be there for your client, right? And I worked in community mental health. So clients literally just walk in whenever they want. Like I'm in the community, they come to the office for whatever reason. I think there's this one client who came in, I think it was like 5 times that week asking about the same thing. And I just got really fed up and frustrated, and I almost yelled at them. Actually, at some point, I did yell at them because I like. So this is an example of an unhealthy boundary because I should have established earlier on that like, hey, like I'm going to address this issue, and I need you to give me time to do it. But if you come in every single day, like after the second or third day, I should have just been like, hey, like I'm not going to address this until next week. Like it'd be very clear with you that there's other things I have to get done, right? But then I just kind of let them for the next few days, and then they came back, and I'm just like, yo, let's like get out of my face. But that is an example of not expressing a bad example as a therapist of, hey, this is not what you're supposed to. And
And
so,
that's why it's so important to establish boundaries early on, right?
Mhm.
Because when you let these lines in the sand be drawn and pushed and pushed and pushed, when you buck back, now all of a sudden it's confusing to the other party because that's the only boundary they've ever known, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
So be clear, be concise.
I mean, if you think about it, we somewhat do that as therapists, not somewhat. When we start off, remember when we shared about the therapeutic process, we talked about informed consent. We're going through a lot of what I call ground rules.
Yeah,
That's our way of setting boundaries for the sake of a healthy therapeutic alliance, right? Yeah. So
absolutely.
I agree with what you said, hands down. Always, I call them ground rules, even in my family. We're like, we are going to have some ground rules here because you've got to put them in early. And it's okay if they're broken and there's confusion here and there, as long as the core is understood from the get go, you know. But yeah, I'm hearing. I was going to say the sentence I was going to say is, I think we're all agreeing that unhealthy boundaries, correct me if I'm wrong, may result in unhealthy behavior.
Hmm.
oftentimes it does. I would agree with that. And then,
Yeah.
Yeah,
kind of, I realize we're kind of like deviated, but coming back, right? Like, so what are like some specific? So we went earlier. We were talking about like, hey, what does enmeshment look like? What does healthy boundaries look like? Um, I think maybe we should talk about some examples of that, and
Mhm.
maybe provide a little bit more like clinical kind of detail about like what unhealthy boundaries are, and kind of detail those. Like, what is enmeshment? What does that look like specifically? You know,
Mm-hmm.
like I mean, Chris touched on it earlier. Like, what is codependent, right? So let's kind of switch gears for a second and kind of go back in what some of those are. Yes, to get started, um, go back to. Do we want to go back to codependency? Let's go back to codependency, right? And let's give some examples of how we've seen it play out. I think that way it would be easier for our audience to kind of identify.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think of codependency within like couples. That's what comes to mind kind of first. Of course, that exists in a lot of relationships, not just that. Um, but I don't work with couples, so I'll let maybe Chris talk about that. I see it on the side of like the female because that's often the clients that I'm seeing. So I kind of see like
stereotypically,
the
yeah.
huh?
Stereotypically, yeah.
Stereotypically, yeah. Although it's not, I mean, it's not always the case where,
Sure.
but I see it in the sense that like codependency, both of them are affected though, right? But
Yeah,
what I
Yeah.
see, since I tend to
Feeding off
see
each other.
women, yeah, is like the female side of it. Um, and it has all different types of dynamics. And sometimes it's not, it doesn't start off that way, right? It grows into that. And so sometimes it's due to health conditions, right? Where one person is chronically debilitated. And so that other person tries to come in, right? And to fill in those spaces that they feel is caretaking. But then it becomes this sense of, right, I don't have a delineation where my life is away from this person because I'm a caretaker. And so I over assume too much responsibility in that person's life. And
absolutely.
so I've seen kind of that dynamic kind of come up. And I've also seen ones in which, maybe one person's career, right, is very demanding. And so, in service of that overall career goal, the other person starts to shift and become small and
Yeah,
adapt into that other person's life, thinking like I'm being supportive, thinking I'm being there for that person, but in fact, sacrificing themselves.
Yeah.
And so I
Where they
think
would get
when
the
I
resentment.
say again,
No, that's when they would get the resentment for doing
exactly.
that, you
Yeah.
know?
Yes,
And you see that
exactly.
blow up.
Hmm.
That's a great analogy. I have one.
Sure.
Parent child.
Hmm.
So the codependency there would be, believe it or not the parent wanting to feel needed, almost a little bit of the helicopter parent taking care of, and then the child feeding off of that. And it's like the more the parent gives, the more the child takes. And I see that a lot in the teen, parent relationships. And even my own husband has accused me of almost being enmeshed like that with our oldest son. Not because it's like a spoiling thing or I feel like I need to be needed, but I guess because I feel like he's my first son. I need to take care of him, making sure he's, it's like that safety thing. Everything's new for me with him with college, and I'm like, oh my gosh. And so I was thinking of this just being vulnerable here. Like it came out recently as I'm preparing him from college. My husband's like, okay, seriously, he's depending too much on you, and then you're depending on him, looking at his reaction to make you do this. It's like the emotional reaction to each other. And I was like, I resented it because obviously the first thing when you hear criticism you don't like, then I went, okay, I see your point. Yeah, because if he gets a little stressed, then I'm stressed because I want to make sure he's not stressed. And then it becomes this pattern. So yes, that's why, and then I see it a lot also with the parents and families I work with. So the codependency with the, parent and child, not the
Yeah.
parentification, but just feeding off the emotions, right? You're feeding off each
Yeah.
other,
Yeah.
not healthy.
I think any adult relationship, at least, is two independent people who choose to be together. Two independent people who are happy, who are satisfied, ideally, right? Like that's the dream, and choose to love each other, show and support each other, right? When you gave those examples, Jenny, that's often what I see in terms of codependence when someone's needs begin to be ignored, right? There's a difference between compromise and ignoring someone's needs as well, right? Sometimes you do have to make those compromises because that's the way life is. But oftentimes I see that codependence in my couples, and often I see it when someone is consistently disrespecting another person's boundaries, right?
Mm.
I work a lot with infidelity, and it's surprising to me when I started working with it that I have probably a 70 to 80% success rate with infidelity, as long as they are committed to the process, right? And if they're committed to the process, they often build a far better relationship than they had before because now they actually have an understanding of all of these hidden boundaries that they weren't communicating before.
Mm.
But I also sometimes see couples where one partner is constantly and consistently disrespecting the needs of the other, right? I
Mhm.
will cheat and you will have to deal with it. You know, I will do this and you just have to deal with it. It is your place, it is your this and that. And I hear it from, stereotypically, yeah, it's tends to be the male dominating, but I've seen both dynamics play out.
Mhm.
Mm.
So I have a question for you, Chris, in that like scenario. Um, when there's a more kind of dominant person who maybe is disregarding that other person's needs, do you find that they're always conscious of it? They are like aware, or do you think it's a more subconscious process where they're ignoring that other person's needs? Or is it like 50-50?
I think it's complicated. Sometimes they are conscious of it, and that's the dynamic that they actually want, right? They don't want to
Mhm.
be pinned as the bad person, but that's what they're actually looking for. Sometimes the way I look at it is more of to try to empathize with their position, at least, is that their anxiety is so
Mm.
high that they are unable to see other people's perspective. They're so
Mhm.
trapped in their own dialogue. That's something that I talk about a lot too, is that we only know our own dialogue, right? We only assume and try to read and gauge other people's inner dialogues. So
Mhm.
sometimes they're just unable to really, escape their own, and because of that, are only able to see their needs.
Yeah.
That's what a lot of couples therapy is, and that's what is also frustrating about couples therapy is playing with those dynamics and push pull, right? Of having
Mhm.
to side with people a little bit to get them to open up, and then trying to rearrange those power dynamics. It's
Mhm.
complicated.
I
Yeah.
think that's fun. I might be like a little sick to myself. But I enjoy kind of make things work. I mean, I primarily work with families, right? And you do see a lot of that give and take, and like you have to be nicer to somebody in order for them to get to open up, and then have to like use those, you're like simultaneously building like therapeutic relationships in one place. And I think it's actually really engaging. A lot of MFTs, I guess, don't like doing that because it's complicated, but I think it's fun. I think helping people to see those connections that they have and like what they don't talk about. I think at the core of it, unhealthy relationships mostly, or unhealthy boundaries, come from a lack of communication.
Right.
And
Mhm.
I'll say it's rewarding. I'll say it's very rewarding, but when I have to go through 8 hours of it in a day,
Yeah,
I
that's a
hate my
lot.
life sometimes, right? But,
yeah,
But it is
it's fun.
rewarding. Yeah,
Absolutely.
when
Whenever I
change
see it
happen.
succeed, it's beautiful. I
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
actually had just had a session this week where, they were on the verge of divorce. Like that was the entire plan, right? But, that's not how it played out after what we've worked through and, months later, that's where we're at now, It's hopelessness and now after establishing good boundaries, everything's good again. So we'll
Mhm.
see what happens.
yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's awesome.
But
That's why you
highlighting,
continue to work with couples.
yeah, but highlighting the communication aspect of it, right? I think breaking down boundaries a little bit more, it is that idea of like understanding what they are, like understanding
Sure.
what is and isn't there. I think a lot of the times unhealthy boundaries is, well, it's so hard to like distinction, like make a distinction between boundaries and relationships because boundaries only exist in context of relationship. So
Well, here's the thing too. We've also been talking a lot about enmeshment and
mhm.
codependence, right? But what about rigid boundaries? What does
Yeah,
that look
Rich.
like? How
That
do
was the
we?
example I was trying to give you, or detached,
Mm-hmm.
you
Absolutely.
Mhm.
know?
So yeah, and when that happens in families when one of the parents decides I don't want anything to do with this, and just like whoop, just like anytime something happens, they just like leave the room, or anytime something happens, they like this is it, and then that's it. Like they said it and it's done, and you can argue because it'll just further escalate or whatever, right? And so those are things where you have to work with them to try to break it down. But what do rigid boundaries look like? Rigid boundaries looks like if you don't do something, then there are the consequences are astronomical in proportion to what has happened, right? I want to say like an example of a rigid boundary that may or may not be a good or bad thing, right? Is say like a curfew, right? Sometimes it's a good thing for protection. Sometimes it's a bad thing because, well, like depending on what the age is and what the time is, there's like what works for the family, all that kind of stuff. But that is a rigid boundary. Like you have to be home by this time, right? Like I think that's a very good example of what rigidity is. Like, that cannot be moved. Like this is it. Like you have the curfew is the rigid boundary. Maybe the time is a little bit more permeable, but like the rigid boundary is curfew. You have to be home.
And of course, I would see that as a good rigid boundary, having kids that I have to control. But
Sure.
yeah, I mean, the best example I gave was just my experience with my in-laws. That's all. It was just, this is the way we are, so you conform to us, and we won't change, you know.
Sure.
And so to break through, it's just it felt very suffocating, and then no room for honest emotional attachment.
Yeah.
It's almost like they didn't want that emotional attachment. They go, this is the way it's supposed to be. Daughter-in-laws are here and the
Yeah.
mother-in-law is here. And, so
Yeah.
that's just to me. And if people are experiencing that, then that would be rigid to me. Is the word detached or diffuse? Isn't it
They're
diffuse
different
boundaries?
though. Those terms are
They're
different.
different. Okay, let's differentiate. I know we know what detached means, but there's diffuse boundaries as well.
Diffuse
Uh-huh.
boundaries means things can move. They're permeable, right? Am I
Mhm.
They're
mistaken?
kind of like
But the same.
I mean, I
Okay.
don't I don't know if I've heard of detached as as a
in reference to
type of
boundaries.
boundary.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
Yeah, maybe
detached is
that's more
more of
like
a
the emotional
relational,
attachment. Yeah.
yeah, like a
So it's either
relational style.
permeable or diffuse. Diffuse. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's going
Yeah.
back to therapy
So
101. Yeah.
So yeah, in over adherence to rules and consequences. Sometimes you have to be clear and consistent when you're establishing boundaries, and then you can add some flexibility to them, right?
Mhm.
But when
Exactly.
that rigidity is the only thing available to you, that's when it becomes complicated. Or, going back to the emotional aspect, if there is an extreme detachment, or cold and distanceness or aloofness, either in the other person or even in yourself, you may be the one responsible for some of these unhealthy boundaries, right? And when
Yeah.
one person feels like they're not being heard and understood, what is causing that space between those two people? That's very important to identify. And also understanding if someone is detached, at least in my personal opinion, if someone is detached from you, going at them will not make them engage, right? In that pursuer distancer dynamic. If they're withdrawing, running at them is not going to make them come at you. It's just going to make them withdraw more. You have to give
Yeah.
people space to also reconnect with you. And
Right.
then you also have to determine whether or not it's worth it to do the work sometimes to repair these boundaries, right?
Yeah.
And that's the cycle that you see with these boundaries, right? Someone who emotionally distances themselves, and then the person tries to, grab them back in, and then that's part of what we do is break some cycles that we see
Absolutely.
through the boundaries. Yeah. I finished my mochi. That might be the end of the episode.
Nice. Perfect timing.
Was that
All
a
right.
big hint? No, I'm kidding. Did we go through that unhealthy boundaries, audience?
Yeah, I hopefully we covered everything that we needed for this specific episode. If
There's
not,
a lot to discuss, right?
let us know. We'll definitely end up retouching this in so many other
It's gonna
times.
come up again. Like
Yeah.
boundaries is a big part of therapy because of how big a role it plays in our lives. Because literally every person that you interact with, you have boundaries with, and like it's almost impossible to be aware of every single boundary that you're having with every person, and a lot of
Yeah.
it goes unsaid, and a lot of it we're not even aware of. Like, to be perfectly honest, there are boundaries that you have established for yourself that you just don't know that you've put there, and you won't
Mhm.
know until somebody violates it. And you're like, hold on, that doesn't sit well with me. And
Yeah.
when you get to that point, then I think it's time to start to. But it is good to kind of be aware of what kinds of boundaries are out there, and especially knowing what unhealthy ones look like. And so hopefully we've given you a good idea, like a good starting point. But we can definitely get more into.
Well, but our next episode, we're going to talk about what healthy boundaries look like, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And how to continue those.
We're gonna
healthy
go
boundaries.
into more specifics with boundaries. So
Yeah.
like family,
Yeah.
workplace, relationships.
Definitely the workplace.
Yeah, definitely.
Or maybe
I
we'll
think
just have a
closing-
whole series dedicated to each of those. Well, we'll do one episode for each of those and be like,
Yeah.
this episode is about how to establish or what boundaries you may have in the work. I don't know.
Yeah.
We'll see.
The
We'll see how it
workplace
plays out.
boundaries are very difficult as well, right? There's definitely unhealthy
Absolutely.
boundaries in place at work that we can discuss. But for the sake of time, since I'm done the mochi, so we we can move on to the next week's episode, and next week.
Yeah. So we'll
Right.
see y'all.
Bye bye.
Bye, y'all.